I've jointed all my boards. I've got a nice flat face with a nice straight edge, perfectly 90 degrees to that flat face on each of the boards. Next step is to chuck them through the thickness planer and maybe cut them to size on the table saw. Good to go, right? Well, yeah, that's one way of doing it, but depending on what you are trying to achieve, that may not actually be the best solution. So stick around and I'll show you how I go about square dressing material so you end up with boards that are perfectly flat, perfectly square, and exactly the same dimensions for every one. It's at this point that a lot of people would put the boards through the thickness planer, get them to an even thickness before taking them to the table saw to cut them to the width that they want. I too will do that if the boards are wider than 9 inches. And I say wider than 9 inches because my thickness planer will only accept a board on its edge that is around 9 inches or less. Anything that's less than that in width, I will actually put them through the thickness planer first on edge to get a nice straight edge perfectly parallel to the one that I did on the jointer before I then flip it over and just do a final pass on the jointed edge. Then I go ahead and put the board through the thickness planer to clean up the face parallel to the one that I did on the jointer. And again, flip it over and do one final pass on the original face. I do this for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want to be breaking up the process when I'm in the middle of square dressing my boards. And secondly, and more often than not, especially if it's not just boards that I'm gluing up, I don't want to have, saw marks and stuff in the potential saw marks in the boards. So by doing it where everything goes through the thickness planer, I end up with boards that are exactly the same thickness, exactly the same width, and all 4 surfaces are absolutely pristine. You may be a little worried about thinner boards and the stability. Typically, it's not really an issue. The in-feed and out-feed rollers will actually hold the board down square to the table and there is no issues. You may have issues with wider boards if they're really quite thin and the board actually deflecting from the pressure of the feed rollers. And in that instance, obviously you're better off making your parallel cuts on the saw. But for most boards sort of from probably 1/2 inch up, you're probably good to put it through your thickness planer. So occasionally you'll run a board over the jointer on the face, but when you go to run the edge over the jointer, the grain is in the wrong direction. And for some people, they will, run it through the thicknesser then, and having a separate thicknesser, that's not really that big a deal, and then bring it back and change it around so that they can joint the edge with the grain. I don't bother. I'll run the face over, and then even if it's against the grain, I'm going to run that board and I'll just run it a little bit slower to minimize tear out. And then when I'm marking the grain direction on the board, I'll just mark it in the direction that it should have gone and then place that there. So because I'm then going to run that board through the thicknesser in the right direction for the grain that way, and then turn it around and do it on the jointed edge, I'm actually going to clean up any small amounts of tear out that happen when I actually ran it against the grain when I was jointing it. So I should add too that jointing a longer board, you're going to have, and you can even see this on this board, on the face grain of this board, there's a great big sort of oval pattern here happening. And that's because the grain is actually running in two different directions. So keep that in mind too, because it's not always possible to be running with the grain when you're dressing material. And especially with the newer helical heads, going against the grain a bit isn't that big a deal. So yes, we want to try and be going with the grain as much as possible. And on a board that's this long, do your best to be going with the grain for as much of the cut as possible. Okay, so let's take a look inside this planer jointer combo. Before I actually put the guard / dust hood up, we can actually see a little bit of what is going on here. You can see the cutter head obviously here. And here is the in-feed roller, and that's the out-feed roller right there. The in-feed roller and the out-feed roller are both spring-loaded essentially. These screws here are to adjust the amount of tension put down on the in-feed and out-feed rollers, and there's one obviously on either side. So now we're looking inside the thickness planer, and we can see how as the board travels through, the first thing it's going to do is go underneath these anti-kickback poles, and that's just simply to stop it kicking back. The next thing, it's going to go underneath the in-feed roller, which grips the board and pulls it through. The next thing is the pressure bar, which essentially is there to ensure that in the event we put a big, long, say, heavy board in and it actually kicks the in-feed roller up out of the way, that it's not going to be able to, the board when it hits the cutter head isn't going to be able to take a huge cut. So that's a solid fixed bar that while it does have a little bit of give, it essentially won't allow the board to go up too high. So the next thing obviously is the cutter head, where it goes under the cutter head and the material is thicknessed down to size. Then it goes under the rear pressure bar, and finally the outfeed roller. Thinking back to the fact that these infeed and outfeed rollers are spring-loaded, if I put pressure on the back of this board, you can see that the roller actually lifts up. I can lift that roller up. So you can imagine with a big, long, heavy board, if I don't, if you like, hold the weight of that big, long, heavy board until it hits the outfeed roller, I could end up with snipe. And once it passes the infeed rollers, again, if that board is too long and heavy without support, it has the potential to lift up the outfeed roller and create snipe in the end of the board. This is why it's so important to take the weight of the board both when you're feeding it into the thickness planer and when you're taking it out at the other end of the thickness planer. Okay, so with that in mind, we need to think about how we're going to run our boards through. If we're running one board through at a time, we can put it through the right side, the left side, the middle side, whatever. However, if we've got a lot of boards to run, and maybe think about it this way, I've got a 16-inch wide planer here, and if I've only got boards that I want a thickness that are 2 or 3 or 4 inches wide, it doesn't make a lot of sense that I would put one board through at a time. Surely it would make more sense, right, if I put at least a couple of boards through at a time. The thing, though, that we have to think about, knowing now how the feed rollers work, and that they're connected on both sides. They can only move like this. So we need to think about if we're feeding a board through, whether that be on the edge or on the flat, and we feed a board through right next to it that is slightly smaller in dimension, then the feed roller won't be able to stay in contact with the smaller of the two boards, and it won't be held down. The concern with this, of course, is getting kickback. Now we have those anti-kickback poles that certainly tend to stop pretty much all of the kickback, unless, of course, the boards are that much different that the anti-kickback poles don't actually engage with the smaller of the two pieces. And in that case, you could potentially feed the board in, perhaps accidentally feed it in, hit the cutter head and have it shoot back out at you because it is that small. That's the worst case scenario, of course. The other thing that we have to be aware of is if the anti-kickback poles actually stop it from kicking back, the thing that may well happen as the boards go through together is that this board that is smaller will be flapping around, hitting the cutter head and going up and down, and you're going to end up with a really shitty job on the top surface of that board once it gets out the other end. Okay, so what I've got here is 4 boards. 2 are a little bit wider than the others. These are just offcuts of material. So what I've done is just cut one of these boards down, and this is very typical of how things go day to day as I'm square dressing things. I'm always going to have boards. While I might even rip them up, sometimes it takes a few more passes over the jointer to get an edge dead straight, and therefore one board ends up not as wide as the others. So I've done that to both of these, and I'm going to show you first off with these wider ones when I put them through, and the same, this, just to be clear, this is exactly the same whether it is on the edge or on the flat, same sort of results. So what we'll do is put these through the wrong way perhaps, and let's just see what happens, and then we'll see how we can improve that. Okay, that was a little sketchy. It was exactly what I knew would happen. Take these out. Now, as you can see at the very start of this cut, it really grabbed, and I sort of shot my arm away because, there's a concern, obviously, when there's a difference in the width or thickness of the material that's going through the machine. When it's side by side like that, that the smaller of the two boards could be shot out the back. So how do we avoid that? Well, it's actually really simple. So again, we've got these 2 different boards. So this time I'm going to put them through on either side of the planer, and it doesn't matter if your planer is 24 inches wide or 12 inches wide. This will be the same. This is how you want to do it to avoid that kickback. All right, so huge difference there, right? This edge is nice and clean, and this edge is nice and clean. And the difference is, it's just, if that were the in-feed roller, it's basically held down at each end, right? So if I've got, a a piece of material, this is very exaggerated, but one piece that's much higher than the other going under this roller, while this lifts it up, this one obviously it's not being held down by anything. But if it were over here like this, obviously it's still able to sort of hold it down on both ends because that's where the pressure is. So that's probably the safety side of it, you know, trying to avoid material shooting back out of the thickness planer. And that's primarily the number one reason why it happens. Like I said, it doesn't matter whether it's on material on edge or on flat, it's always going to be like that. So there you have it. 4 boards of identical thickness. 2 of each are identical in their width. Each board is dead on square in both ways. That to me is the best way for me to square dress material. Whenever I can, I'm going to run it through the thickness planer, both on edge and then obviously, you know, on the flat. Hopefully this video has been helpful. It's given you a better understanding of how the thickness planer works and the limitations, I guess, when it comes to the in-feed and out-feed rollers, and obviously then what you have to keep in mind when you're putting material through, or multiple pieces of material. Having said that, I guess once you've put the pieces through and they are all identical in width or whatever, if you're putting them through like that, you could also, you know, put a bunch of them together and put them through. It's not, you know, there's going to be basically even pressure on each of the boards. So you're not going to risk the chance of one board, you know, not having the pressure and getting shot out the back of the thicknesser. So hopefully too, it's given you an idea of the limitations when it comes to planing longer, heavier boards, and how you can reduce the amount of snipe at the ends of the cuts by just taking the weight. So if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already subscribed, please do. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you in the next video.